Cool. Welcome to you all. It's the Open Source Security Foundation Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group meeting, and today is December 14th. So we have a few topics here that are here on the agenda, and I think there's one that Florencia wants to talk about that I didn't add to the agenda, but I hope we can find the time to cover that, because I think, Florencia, you mentioned that the next meeting that's in 2 weeks is not a good fit. So let's try to make sure that we have some time at the end to cover that as well. If I remember correctly, the last time we met, we decided to kind of split into a couple of subgroups and tackle the problem of documenting use cases for a couple of different personas. And I've been kind of watching that in those 2 weeks, and I think that we made a lot of progress there. So I would want to like circle back to that towards the very end. But I also remember that one of the personas we concluded we didn't know too much about, or we didn't have representatives of, was the sort of tool scanner vendor. To this end, we have Jason today and Riz to tell us more about this part of the story, because I think it's, as we sort of, at least the last time we discussed vulnerability disclosures from the perspective mainly of the security researcher and the maintainer, but we haven't actually dug into, okay, now that we disclose something, what happens with this information? Who collects it? Is that information all they need? I have a hunch that most tool scanning vendors kind of need to enrich that information even further. Yeah, and I really hope to have more discussions about workflows and personas and actors in that ecosystem. So Jason, do you want to kick this off? I saw you have a nifty slide deck.
Yeah, sure. Can you give me permission to share the screen? I think you have to hand it over. It's not letting me.
Yeah, absolutely. There you go. You're the co-host now. Hopefully that's enough for you to share.
Thanks. Yeah, I got it. And just so everyone's aware, I have, I don't know if it's been merged yet, but I have a pending PR to add this slide deck to the documentation folder. So folks will be able to get it off of GitHub after the call.
Yeah, so I'll merge it right away after the call. I haven't merged it yet.
Yeah, no problem. So thanks a lot for giving me a couple minutes to present our perspective today. I'm not going to go into a lot of different background myself in the interest of time. I basically run our threat management portfolio. So a lot of our different software regarding security, I run the technical direction of it. But because of that, where I sit, I've actually kind of at one point or another played almost all of the different roles in these personas, both as a open source maintainer, a software developer, somebody who's managing the people who are developing the software, and also the vendor who has to receive the patches from the other different people, the other open source projects. We've kind of sat through all of it. So we have a pretty good perspective, I think, on some of the different personas that are at play here. Definitely not all of them, as I'll get into, but I think we have a good sampling. And I want to thank, there's a few different folks in the working group who contributed to the deck as well. Definitely see Rob and some others, so I want to thank them. So I'm going to be pretty quick here. The way that I approach this to kind of structure the conversation is I'm taking basically what we call an IBM, this design thinking approach. And really what it revolves around is this idea of breaking your problem set into the different personas that we have to deal with the problem, and then trying to unpack their needs, their wants, their desires, so that we can have a better idea of what we're trying to solve. And it's really all about this challenge here. I love this meme. I don't know if everyone's seen it, but when you have a big problem, it's kind of like an elephant in a dark room, right? And depending on which part of the elephant you're looking at and what point in time, you're going to see something completely different. And it's not until you turn the lights on and everybody sees, all that everyone was right, but you really have to put everything together if you want to get the whole picture of what you're actually looking at. And I think this problem set's like very much like that. There's all these different personas involved in the vulnerability disclosure process in open source. And we've really got to kind of take a look at everyone's different point of view if we want to decompress the entire end-to-end problem here. Again, this whole idea, it's called design thinking, and it's basically around this idea that you want to empathize with the different target audiences you have, and then figure out what they want to achieve, and then really quickly iterate and brainstorm on solutions to their specific problems. And it kind of helps you take yourself out of your own perspective and kind of inject you into some other people's perspective, what they have to deal with in their daily life, which isn't necessarily always the same as what you have to deal with. So personas that I'm going to get into, what is a persona? A persona it's a fictional character that you try to create based on your research of the different problem sets that you're trying to tackle. And you're supposed to create personas that represent the different types of users that are going to either use your service or your software, or in our case, the different types of personas that are involved in vulnerability management in the entire end-to-end lifecycle. And the purpose of that is to help you, step outside of yourself and recognize that different people have different needs, different expectations, and they can help you kind of identify with the different problem sets that different groups have. So without further ado, I'll get into some of the different personas that I believe we have to deal with. Again, I'm not saying that, this is the be all end all. There's probably more that we've forgotten. But I do think it's a good starting point, and hopefully a good place to open up a good discussion. So the first persona I think is probably the most obvious for most of the folks here, and that's the developer, the maintainer, and the lead developer of an open source library. In this case, we've named her Alice. Alice, she really wants her project to be useful to other people. She wants it to reflect positively on her own eminence as a developer. What do I mean by that? Basically, she wants her project to have quality code, right? What are her pain points as a developer and maintainer? She may not be compensated at all to work on this project. Maybe she is, maybe she's not. We don't know. They have a lack of supporting resources, and the priorities of the community that are consuming their code, they may not align with their own priorities or even their goals, right? They're trying to advance their project. They're trying to take it in certain directions. The people who consume the project may think that it should go in a different direction, but it doesn't necessarily align with their own. And that's certainly true very often when you're talking about security. I actually there was somebody posted up a interesting survey there on the weekend. I don't think it was tied to OpenSSF, but it said that most open source developers felt like doing cybersecurity was a death march, and it was like a soul draining activity. So that really just goes to the last point there, that the priorities of the community may not align with the actual developer priorities. Next persona, and this is where things I think start to get interesting, is the vulnerability researchers. So this is Abby, and they're the ones that run penetration tests. They try to find the vulnerabilities in software. I think we all understand this one fairly well as well. Their needs are, they want to discover vulnerabilities before threat actors, and they want recognition and credit for discovering vulnerabilities. And that's really a large motivating factor for this persona, because it's really how they measure success and how they grow their career is receiving that credit. So it is important. Their pain points tend to be unknowns caused by projects that don't have these well-published disclosure policies. So when you find a new vulnerability in a project and you don't know where to report it, and you don't know, and the person that you do report it to or individuals, they're not responsive, that's a very large pain point. And it leads to the third problem here. when a researcher has a vulnerability and they find out that their vulnerability is exploited in the wild before they've been able to publish their findings, that's really a worst case scenario for them. And that's why, they tend to push to have that publication be done as soon as possible, because the threat actors aren't waiting. The threat actors don't care about disclosure policies. And if they found it, then somebody else can probably find it as well. Now, this is where you get into the persona that I find we're not talking a lot about, and a couple of the following ones. So Fin is that vulnerability management vendor, and also the vulnerability management practitioner inside a company. And what Fin does is they detect vulnerabilities that exist both inside the client environment as well as perhaps outside the client environment by scanning remotely. And Fin, if I had to name vendor names here, Fin is like a Qualys, a Tenable Nessus, White Source, SNCC. And they, their needs are they really want notice of the new vulnerabilities as they're discovered and disclosed as fast as possible, so they can add them to their database, so they can start detecting them for all of the customers in the world. And they want to have suggested remediations for those if possible, so that their products can recommend how to remediate these vulnerabilities when they find them for their customers. And one of their largest pain points is there's no industry standard location for vulnerability reports. We have NVD, which is kind of the largest, but there's a whole slew of other vulnerability report locations, and NVD is very far from all encompassing. Then you've got Cherry. So Cherry is a software developer that's consuming open source code. So she could be, name any Fortune 1000 software vendor. And they're building software to solve for customers' use cases, and they want to be able to use best of breed open source libraries to streamline their development. And they really just want to develop that secure and high quality software. Their large pain point is it's very difficult to know how to secure these libraries. And when open source libraries have new vulnerabilities, it's difficult to be informed of them because there, again, it ties back to that central repository and lack thereof. Finally, second last persona we have here is Jacob, and they're the line of business owner at a company. So basically, Cherry builds software, and Jacob is consuming that software. So this Jacob is kind of the end of the line. He's the person actually running the software that's vulnerable. And what he's most interested in is having the software that he runs for his company run stably, and that it's reliable and that it's secure. And he has to maintain that security posture as mandated by his CISO and BISO. And his pain is that, the BISO and CISO are escalating looking for software to be patched, and his vendor doesn't have a patch. And, he also learns about vulnerabilities before his vendors even have a disclosure for the patch. And people, sometimes folks may wonder how can that ever be the case? And it's actually extremely common. It's extremely common for an end customer to find out about a vulnerability before even the vendor that has the vulnerability knows about it. And it's because of the open source supply chain, right? So what'll happen is a vulnerability, a high impact vulnerability will hit the newswire, or Fin will find a vulnerability in the environment that the software vendor has not yet patched and has not yet created a disclosure for, because that's in a dependent library somewhere in the software. So then Jacob will say to Cherry, when is this going to be patched? And Cherry then has to go and react and try to work with the upstream and try to figure out, okay, when can we patch that? We don't know. The last persona is basically what we call the provider persona. And I initially forgot this one. So I want to thank C. Rob for pointing that out. And this is essentially the provider of either an operating system or a cloud provider, so a public cloud provider. They're distributing, packaging, and providing an open source distribution of some kind as part of their service. So this would be the Ubuntu, the Red Hats of the world, also the Azures, the AWS. And they need to be able to interact with upstream communities. They want to be able to remediate those vulnerabilities quickly and get them addressed. And their pain points tend to revolve around, again, this unknowns caused by projects that don't have these well-published and public vulnerability disclosure policies. So there is a nuanced difference between this persona and the Cherry persona, in that Cherry is building software for a solution and then providing it to Jacob. She's not repackaging and redeploying the open source code. Basically, Jacob is not consuming the open source code as the primary function. Whereas if Jacob is consuming from May, he probably is. So there's a subtle difference between those two use cases that I think create very distinct personas. So I don't know if I want to pause there for any questions, but basically those are the layout of the personas that I've identified. And now I'm going to get into a real world scenario of these and play it all through for you. So before I do that, does anyone have any questions? Let's pause. No?
It's all good here.
Not a question. I just wanted to say that those are amazing personas, and I think they're actually more broadly applicable than just this working group. Thanks for all the
I think if this is useful, I think happy to share it to the wider.
Super useful. Thank you.
Hey, and Jason, Teresa is great as well. I'd also add the personas are fantastic, but one thing also to keep in mind in all of this is not all of those personas get much of a say in purchasing decisions, and often the purchasing decision is what drives a lot. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Definitely. Yep. In fact, none of them. The only one here who maybe has a say is Jacob, but even Jacob is probably not the guy who purchased this thing. He's just the guy who's responsible for making sure it works. Right. This is another interesting nuance. It's a very good point, right? What you see
just for missing one?
It probably is. We probably should add another one for the person who owns the solution.
Or at least made the purchase decision.
Yep. Purchaser. Yep. I'll add it's a good catch.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of call to actions after this meeting is to move those persona descriptions, which I also think are excellent, to our GitHub repository, and then I think we can try to either enhance them or add missing ones. So I'll make sure we follow up on that.
Yeah, for sure. These probably each need their own document. I don't think we want to collaborate on the slide deck. But yeah, it's a great point. So I took all those personas and I basically created a real world scenario. And so it's a fictional scenario, but it's the typical scenario that I have experience with. So the scenario, it's pretty simple, really. So you've got this open source library, and I just made up silly names for these. So open source software library, the hot library. It's become very popular in the industry. Hot library is primarily maintained by volunteers. So it's a critical library, but it's not necessarily strongly backed by any one organization. An enterprise software vendor, in this case, Killer Software. So they've integrated the hot library into the latest version of their product. And then customers all over the world use this killer software to run their day-to-day operations. So, you know, it's a huge enterprise software package. Then all of a sudden, a high severity vulnerability is discovered in this hot library. So how does that all play out? So the way that this diagram works is, you know, each persona has a vertical, and the timeline basically goes from top to bottom. And things that are around the same horizontal line are happening more or less in parallel, or potentially in parallel. So what you'll see over here is on the left, you've got Alice. They've developed this hot library, right? And then Abby discovers this vulnerability in hot library. They then disclose it back to Alice, the developer. At that point, one of two different things could happen. So either if Abby's responsive, then they can go and fix the vulnerability. If they're not responsive, then Abby will end up disclosing the vulnerability anyway at some point. So that's basically what the state gate here is showing. In the case that Alice fixes the vulnerability, they'll then publish the vulnerability with a patch on their GitHub repo, presumably somewhere. May or may not have a patch. It may just be publish the code. At that point, this part of the process is more or less completed. But then what happens is we go into the next phase of the process here, where now that there is a public disclosure of this vulnerability, either via one of those two mechanisms, it's now being consumed by the vulnerability databases, NVD and X4, Security Focus, et cetera, et cetera. So Fin now has picked up the fact that this vulnerability exists, and they start looking for it. They start detecting this vulnerability in CI/CD pipelines, inside endpoints, inside the network. And now that they're detecting the vulnerability, Cherry, who's this, so there's one of two different paths you can take here, and this is where it starts to get very complicated, actually. You'll see this blue arrow that goes across, and that's because as soon as Fin finds out about the vulnerability, Jacob now knows about the vulnerability as well, and it can completely bypass Cherry, and it often does. And that's what I'm trying to call out here with this big loopy arrow to point that out, is the fact that Cherry actually often finds out about, whoops, sorry, what is going on here? Yeah, sorry. Cherry actually finds out about vulnerabilities from her own customer. And this is something that, you know, if you're not deeply involved in this, you might find this surprising, but this is actually extremely common, that a customer will basically go to their vendor and say, when are you going to have a patch for X? And that's almost, it's either before or at the exact same time that vendor X is basically running around trying to figure out what this vulnerability is. At that point, the vendor, basically there's two different things that they do. They publish the fact that they have that vulnerability, and then they release a patch with the fix to the vulnerability. These two things, they usually happen at the exact same time. So in this diagram here, it's showing that they publish the vulnerability and then release the patch later. But the reality is that these usually tend to happen either at the same time or extremely close to each other. The vendor tends to not publish a vulnerability without a fix if they don't have to. The other interesting side of this is, you know, when you look at Jacob's vertical, so they're going back and forth with their vendor. I'm trying to find out when they're going to get this patch. And then there's often a mitigation that happens before. So the vendor will tell Jacob, okay, we don't have the patch yet because we haven't heard, you know, there actually isn't one available yet. But if you go and deploy this compensating control, you won't be, you know, the vulnerabilities impact will be severely reduced. And that might be disabling a feature. It might be turning off a service. Maybe it's blocking a port. Maybe it's, changing some credentials temporarily, etc. The compensating controls will be a lot of different things. But basically, they'll tell their customer what to do to mitigate the vulnerability before the patch will actually get out. So that's pretty much it for this flow. And I'll pause there if there's any more questions on this. And then I just have one more slide. Thoughts, questions?
What do you think the biggest culprit is for Cherry finding after Jacob? Do you think it may be a lack of thorough testing?
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting, right? And I don't necessarily think that we're going to have solutions for all these, by the way, in this working group. I just think it's important that everyone has the same, view of all the different areas, because some of these are a wider problem area than just disclosures. So the reason that happens is because, when you think about, so Abby finds this vulnerability, right? And then lets the software developer know about it, regardless of if it takes the path on the left or the right. When there is no communication to Cherry about that vulnerability until it's been disclosed. Oops. Why is this doing this? Like the real issue is that Cherry is consuming that library as a component that's like a readily available component, and she's not necessarily engaged in the day-to-day operations of that open source community, of that library. So she doesn't know about the vulnerability until it's already been patched and disclosed, right? And then as soon as that happens, everybody finds out about it. Finn finds out, and Cherry finds out, and Jacob finds out all at the same time, right? Because of the way that it works. And what'll often happen is, so everybody will find out at the same time, but Cherry's doing a lot of things, and Jacob, who's, it's his primary job to making sure that the solution is secure. So this is the top of his priority list. He'll come to Cherry and say, I just got a news flash about this vulnerability in package XYZ that you're providing me. When is it going to be fixed? And the response will be, okay, we'll get back to you with that 4 hours. And then during that 4-hour window, that Cherry will be trying to figure out when she can get it patched. Because building a patch for that vulnerability, it can take a long time. It's often not simple and cut and dry. Did I explain that well, or did I create more confusion?
Well, what I sort of understood was that when Abby and Alice are communicating about the vulnerability disclosure, that news of the patch gets to Jacob before it gets to Cherry.
Yeah. Basically, it'll kind of hit all three of these at the same time, is the reality. Like once this arrow goes up here, once Finn knows, everybody knows. More or less.
I'll go into that one too, coming up as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Hey, Jason, I think this is a great jumping off point. I think there's some nuance and complexity between the Alice and Abby that we're missing.
Yeah.
You're missing a whole kind of coordinator persona, like the Art Manions of the world, or the Hacker Ones that try to help coordinate these things. And then,
yeah, if it's a large, right, if it's a severe vulnerability, then there's going to be a whole other row in here.
And I don't think there is one finder persona. There's a lot of different motivations and reasonings and paths into that pink box that I think we would need to either have multiple personas or augment your Abby persona with those kind of different perspectives of just, you have academics, security researchers, you have national security folks, you have customers and providers all kind of contribute into that box on some level.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
when I was looking at it, like I immediately like recalled that Vince conversation we had the other day, or other like embargo kind of periods for vulnerabilities. But I think the assumption here is that the like either the project is popular enough, or the user base, or that there is sufficient number of cherries in the world that coordinated action is just not feasible. But I think we don't have to like. I think we can have like multiple different workflows that are typical under some circumstances, right? So we don't have to, I think, focus on just one workflow to kind of have all the personas in it and all the possible circumstances. Like, for example, like there is, as you mentioned, like there are academics that typically result, I think, in large scale disclosure, because they typically like analyze, you know, a bunch of different projects, and those disclosures tend to be like large scale as well. Okay, but overall, like this is fantastic.
Yeah, and so it's a good point, Marcin, there, right? Like I think one of the differences between this scenario and this 2B scenario, by the way, so that I think we need to play out, that hasn't been played out yet, the one with the provider, right? One of the large differences is the sheer number of cherries versus maize, right? So, you know, if you have to look at, if you're trying to coordinate a disclosure among distribution maintainers, right, and providers, you know, you've got, you know, 5 to 10 large ones to coordinate amongst. Whereas when you're talking about the cherries, you're talking about thousands of extremely major vendors you'd have to deal with, right? It gets logistically extremely complicated if you're trying to coordinate that. So yeah, this
I think
is sorry, go ahead.
I think with your cherry pain points, this working group can actively help create some recommendations and tools and documentation to help coach the consumer end. And I think the developer best practices group that I'm a part of can help with the first two kind of personas and help provide open source developers tools and methodologies and help them get set up for success, so that that interaction with the finder can become more productive.
Yeah. So this is pretty much all I had. So I did have that scenario number 2. I'd like to play out at some point to create a kind of flow like that, but we weren't really able to get that done for today. But
we can do it in 2 weeks if you're fine with that, like in our next meeting. Cool. That was perfect. I think like the next step for us here is I'll definitely like merge the PR with the slide deck, so it's available for everyone, and we'll reference it from the meeting notes. But I think then the next immediate step is extracting the information about personas and storing them as individual markdown documents in our GitHub repo, because that and thanks to like Nicole for that idea, then it will allow us to build other artifacts for use cases, and the table that kind of maps all of this together that Crystal has put together. And we're going to be able to like, you know, cross-reference use cases, personas, and perhaps even like the misalignment between those things. And I think that's going to be awesome. So thanks, Jason. So I'll pencil you in for the 28th if you're up for that, and we can explore the second flow. And we also have Riss, who wanted to tell us more about how White Source consumes the vulnerability, disclosed vulnerability information. So Riss, take it away.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to be drilling into what was the Finn, Cherry, Jacob kind of area here. I hope that's helpful. So in terms of how, very broad steps, how we consume vulnerabilities. The first step is some form of automated scraping and parsing of the disclosed information like NVD or other feeds. We then have a manual verification of metadata, and that is the packages, the affected ranges, the fixed in versions. I think anybody new to this area is generally surprised by how messy the raw data is in this area, partly because maybe a lot of us underestimate how complex it is. Sometimes it's not just like a one-to-one mapping between a vulnerability and a package, for example. And then you have multiple fixed in streams and things like that. And then in general, I think there's a lot to be improved in terms of how well structured and semantic that is. But basically, there's a manual verification of that initial pass data. What we do goes a little bit beyond the general. So we do identification of the fixed in commits as well in the original source code. Keeping in mind, this is open source we're talking about, so we can do that. We then do an identification and fingerprinting of affected components and files. So essentially we identify the commit where it was fixed, and we identify or fingerprint the affected files before they were fixed. And then we do a verification ourselves, like a sanity check of the fixed in versions that we got from sort of step 1 and 2 versus what we have identified in the components. It is uncommon, but not rare, that the fixed in version can actually be wrong. Sometimes, you know, someone prepared the CVE description saying a certain version was going to be fixed in, and it's actually a patch after it and things like that, or people didn't correctly patch a stream and things like that. So anyway, this first step is really a bit of human verification of the data. The next step, and this is getting in, there's questions before about the real-time nature of it. So then there's the vulnerability cross-matching. So like a new vulnerability naturally results in a new entry in our database and many other people's databases, but then what? So the higher latency approach, which is used in some areas, is the next time somebody does a scan of their projects, then they'll get new results. You know, so yesterday they scanned and there wasn't a vulnerability, and then today there's a scheduled scan and there's your vulnerability. But this is, I call it high latency. What we do and recommend is a lower latency approach, and that is that when those new entries come into a database, there is an immediate cross-reference between your knowledge of what the project's already had. You know, so who's using this package, this version, and so at that point, you know immediately who's affected, and then the alerts go out. So this is why, so this is us, I guess, sort of as Finn, and this is why Cherry and Jacob can get alerts essentially simultaneously. Let's say that they have both existing scans in the database with packages, versions, fingerprints. There's a match to both of them. They both get alerted. But as mentioned by Jason, sometimes Cherry might have faster, better alerts, and that's why she'll see it before Jacob. Sorry, the other way around. Jacob might have better than Cherry. An important point, I think, here is to talk about package versioning versus the fingerprinting that I mentioned. The industry trend in software development is towards using, deterministic builds with versions and lock files, checksums, that type of stuff. And that's good, and especially good for security, because it means you know exactly what's going into the sausage. But also package lock files with fixed in versions, it makes for very easy identification and fixing. So, if you can exactly identify what version's going into the software, and then you can exactly identify affected version ranges, that's a pretty easy matching. We observed in 2019 that around 85% of NVD disclosures for open source were disclosed with a fixed in version already, meaning that actually industry's got very good at fixing it, releasing, and then disclosing, which means that the answer is, update. It's not like you have a vulnerability and there's nothing really you can do unless you monkey patch it. You actually can update in many cases. However, not all package managers support this type of deterministic build. So also, again, as Jason mentioned, open source might be shipped inside commercial software, like a Docker image, with no passable manifest. So if you're only relying on, very well documented manifests, you will miss things. So scanning file fingerprints and then comparing that against, a database of known open source fingerprints, that's a much more forensic approach for people who, must know what is going into their software and want to be alerted immediately instead of by their customer, for example. In terms of tooling in the software development lifecycle, probably the people in this group understand this, but a lot of people do not outside. So vulnerabilities are rarely introduced in merge requests, pull requests. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings. People kind of think like, hey, if we just shift security left far enough, we can fix security. And that's not how it works. Vulnerabilities are nearly all discovered in existing dependencies that you're already running in production. So no amount of pre-production tooling can protect you from having vulnerabilities in production apps. So identifying vulnerabilities in existing code and quickly remediating them really should be the highest priority, not trying to like squeeze a little bit more, juice out of the lemon in terms of pre-production checks, commits, and scans. We're already getting to the point where people have reached almost an optimum for that. Like I said, this as people coming in the disclosure part probably understand that well, that vulnerabilities are discovered in things you already have. But the majority of the industry believes like we just got to stop developers putting vulnerabilities in our software, and it's just not how it works.
I would like to ask more questions about that slide.
Oh, please go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying vulnerabilities never occur? I mean, where do they get introduced?
No, dependencies are introduced all the time. Oh, excuse me.
But presumably the vulnerabilities are introduced in dependencies that you have added, but they were introduced in merge pull requests inside those dependencies.
True. You're technically correct. I might need to use better terms.
Yeah, but if you are adding something, you tend to, not in all cases, add the most recent thing, which depending on how often that is updated, when you add that most recent thing, it may not already have discovered things. It may contain vulnerabilities, but they're not discovered yet.
Correct.
I think
it might contain the vulnerability, but there are no known vulnerabilities.
Right. No, I got that. But clearly somebody introduced those vulnerabilities at some point, and generally through a merge or pull request. It's just you weren't aware of that when you merged the component in. Which is
true. If I put if I prefix it with known vulnerabilities, I guess that might help.
Yeah.
But by the way, your point is not nitpicking. It is actually very correct, because I mean there is one day people will get better at also scanning open source code themselves. The same way Jacob beats Cherry to the vulnerability at times. The point was that no amount of tooling is really going to be able to, no amount of feasible tooling is going to protect you from having vulnerabilities in production. There are many types of security, like secrets and you could even say fuzzing stuff, firewall rules. There's many areas of security where your goal should be 0. Let's have 0 in production, 0 secrets, 0 firewall mistakes, 0 this. But to aim for 0 open source security problems in production is misunderstanding the problem.
I think your pitch is, shift. It sounds like your pitch is shifting left is a terrible idea because vulnerabilities miraculously appear out of nowhere. And I don't think that's what you mean.
Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I don't think that's what you mean. I think what you mean, though, is that when you include something, vulnerabilities that are extant are not necessarily publicly known. We can still shift left and there will still be problems.
Correct. You can shift as far left as feasible, you still will have problems. Yes, that'd be. Whereas for other areas of security, you could often argue that if you shift left well enough, you should get 0. Like, if I was an engineering manager, and people had secrets or other problems in production, you'd say, well, how did that get there? How do we get better at not getting them in? But for open source security, you have to be realistic. One other thing, vulnerability usage analysis. So One of the reasons why we also do this manual verification of files and components that are affected is because it allows us to do effective usage analysis. So with EUA, project code can be loaded. So Jacob's code can be loaded. Sorry, I keep getting mixed up. Yes, Jacob's code can be loaded. And AST parsing can basically tell you which bits of that tree can be reached and which bits are unreachable. Open source vulnerabilities are often intransitive dependencies, and something like Lodash might have 100 functions, and a library that uses Lodash may only use 5 of them, and there keeps coming up vulnerabilities in the other 95. The reality is, if you're alerted to a transitive Lodash vulnerability, or even a direct Lodash vulnerability for a function you never call, that is a false positive. So in our observations as with customer use, 80% of raw vulnerability alerts are for unreachable code in open source dependencies, which means today, ballpark 80% of vulnerability alerting is false positives minimum.
This one in particular is one of the ones I've been trying to raise the importance of in the SBOM groups, like how important it is to have, like, to me, an SBOM should have that information in it. Like, I'm using this vulnerability and these are the entry points I'm using in it. Because this happens. I agree with that number. It's huge.
Yeah, it's really big. It could be bigger. We don't want to be accused of exaggerating, but we find minimum 80%. All right, a couple more left. Actually, this is, I think, the last one. And one thing I wanted to point out is people have differing priorities. And I'd say in a way it's a little bit shifting priorities as well, like from old to new, in terms of accuracy versus speed trade-offs. So before, like in the old days, when white source was first in the security game, vulnerability data was much more messy and less well structured and described than it is today. So human verification was essential to preventing false positives. Basically, there was a point where, security users were the prime users of this type of software. And if you were constantly, if you tried just doing like fuzzy matching of disclosures and stuff, you would send a lot of nonsense their way. So that human verification step that we have was a necessity in the early days. And as I mentioned, there's some advantages to it right now as well. But this is shifting a little bit. We're finding enterprise users in particular don't want slow positives. And it related a little bit again to Jason's slides about like the vendor being told by the enterprise and things like that. It's a little bit of like an arms race these days where people want to know as soon as possible and even compare in terms of minutes and things like that. To some extent, it's unjustified. In other ways, it is justified. There is a term I love to say about open source security, which is the enemy always gets a vote. So you can't just sort of choose like, well, I'm busy this week, or I'm going to opt out of this because I just don't want to, because they're disclosed. So even if the enemy hadn't discovered the same problem that the researcher did, once it's disclosed, the vote of the enemy is I'm going to probe and scan and things like that. So from our point of view as the Fin in that one, we now, internally have the concept of trusted feeds. So there are certain feeds that are much better structured and we know already have had human triaging in it. And so for those, we have the option to kind of expedite those for real-time matching, like alert before human verification. And that's because the accuracy is good enough that the potential for false positives is not a concern to our users who would prefer to get alerted right away. I think that was the last. Yeah, that was my last slide.
I think if we take this and the previous presentation, I think we have like enough material to write a white paper about it. That I think would be, this is just me thinking out loud, but I think it would be super interesting to maybe release this as an OpenSSF kind of white paper, because Riz, you might be right that there are a lot of people kind of have like an intuition that like it's a, I don't know, like a winnable game, right? I was reading a SANS article on vulnerability management once that started something like this, you can't win at this. So like you need to kind of know what you're doing and what to expect, right? And I think there's, even based on this discussion we had in this meeting today, sounds like there's a lot of nuance, right? You know, personas, workflows, like what do we expect? When do we discover vulnerabilities? How far left can we go? And how much do we really need to leave right in the process to be able to manage that?
Yeah, one other thing I'd add is that with the shifting left that's happened in the last 2 to 3 years, that it does mean that developers become more responsible for handling the alerts. That also means that the false positives, you know, they hurt a lot more. I mean, a security professional might realize that's just part of the game. That's just how it works, is, you know, evaluate, prioritize, can't fix everything. But developers get sent stuff saying this is a high priority, critical priority, and then they dig into it and discover that, you know, it's not being touched. The prioritization of reachable versus unreachable, it can even have like a double-sided too, because, for example, you know, people report to me on some of my projects vulnerabilities that they've found through their scanning or whatever, and they might be like, I literally had one, it's a bit more complicated, but it was literally a dev dependency of a dev dependency. Yeah, and people, you know, report that. So sometimes, even if you know that it is like ineffective or unreachable, you may get so many of your Jacobs alerting you to it that you still want to get rid of it.
Yeah, and honestly, like you as an open source developer, depending on the package manager, have relatively few options to like suppress those issues, because this is typically raised not by your package manager, is raised by your scanning tools. And if you have an open source project, there's a fat chance that it will pop up in scans in a number of different scanning tools that your cherries are using,
Yeah,
and not you as a developer. So that's
I've seen cases where people are just harassing open source maintainers because NPM audit has reported, and they're like, it's your fault, you got to fix it. And it's like completely, like I said, you know, unreachable, ineffective. But, you know, people are like angry because they're saying, I can't deploy to production because we have a rule that says if NPM audit fails, you know, fail the pipeline, things like that.
And it's you can't even point the finger too much, because it actually often traces back to mandatory compliance directives and regulations. So there will be entire classes of software that are regulated that cannot be deployed with XYZ vulnerable packages. And because the scan says that it's vulnerable, even though the code is unreachable, because we don't have any kind of an audit trail or supply chain SBOM that's reliable, right? You have nothing to fall back on, right?
Yeah.
It's not good enough to just stand. It's not good enough to just say it's not reachable. You have to be able to prove it, right?
And that's where the onus of responsibility falls upon that development team or that product manager that is leveraging these free and open source pieces of code to have some level of investment into that. Not just to say it's that upstream developer's responsibility, sure, but they get no compensation aside from it's fun, it's a part-time thing. I thought it's a really awesome idea. So again, trying to harangue the upstream developer is not a worthwhile endeavor. You need to find ways we can help assist those developers and help educate the cherries of the world to make better choices, to build in tooling so that you can get these automated feeds, so that you can contribute back upstream if you find these issues.
Yeah, but
if I could quickly jump in, I mean, if I'm the open source developer and says, hey, fix it, and I'm going, oh, what contract did I sign with you? Oh, none. How much are you paying me? Nothing. Okay, very cute. You may go on with your life. Please stop bothering me. I think a lot of developers do actually respond, and I'm grateful to them, but you know, there's only so much time in the day. I will counter though that I've seen the other direction, where the vulnerability, something is claimed to be a vulnerability, tools claim it's a vulnerability. I think the ITS4 paper had a great example of this. You know, they were sure that it couldn't be exploited. A year later, oh look, there's the exploit. Yes. So I am actually quite sympathetic to the problem of, you know, the tool vendors could just fix the tools by adding information about, oh, this is not actually vulnerability, but how do they get enough confidence to be assured of that? And often that's a really rough road to travel.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, Riz, thank you. There's definitely, I think, a lot to thank, and like
Thanks,
some, you know, I think the good discussions and a few good points. Like Florencio here, I think you wanted to add to that, because I think you started to tackle this topic in one of the other working groups. So if we have a few more minutes, then I'll definitely be super willing to let Florencio tell us more about his initiative.
Yeah, the initiative is about is related to this. What open source project says is that they receive a lot of feedback about vulnerabilities. It's about the reporting of a vulnerability from a researcher to the open source project maintainer. And sometimes project maintainers receive like dumps of scanning tools, a dump of a fusser tool, or just findings of different tools. So this initiative was aimed to develop maybe yes little projects aimed to work on communicating to the community how to better report vulnerabilities. For example, publishing a checklist of things that you can do before reporting a vulnerability. Like for example, saying if you can develop a patch, that's the best thing you can do. Maybe you cannot develop or contribute with a patch, but maybe you can send a reproducer. If you cannot send a reproducer, maybe you can point where is the vulnerability in the code in the code. But please don't send just the result of a scanning tool of or a fuzzer to the project maintainers, because they have, like all we have, a limited quantity of time to invest, and it is better to invest it on really fixing the vulnerabilities and not triaging them, or working on discarding the vulnerability. So the idea of the initiative is to develop assets for this, like I said, a checklist, guidelines about how to verify common vulnerabilities that are reported, like security headers, publishing a template for reporting potential flaws to the software maintainers, maybe helping in improving or the security tools to have the key information that could be useful for the maintainers. So I started working on this on the tooling working group because a lot of this is about tools, but maybe it is better to have it here. So just wanted to comment, and what do you think? And if do you think it might fit here, maybe move it to this working group.
I think, and anyone else feel free to chime in, but we were trying to, at least initially, not necessarily create any new formats for anything, but we were going to try and reference ones that were out there and suggest them. So if you're like, and I wasn't 100% clear, were you recommending creating a brand new template, or were you recommending
No,
kind of pointing to templates?
If it exists, it is better to use. I think it is better to use something that already exists for sure. Maybe centralizing it somewhere, or maybe just help disclosing this, or promoting this existing standard.
Yeah, if there's some standards out there, I do think that overlaps with things we want to be trying to do in this group.
I think this might be one of those topics where it actually spans multiple different working groups and areas. To me, there's definitely an element of promoting a good security policy that explains, what goes into a good vulnerability report. But good best practices and tooling, definitely I see some overlap there as well.
Mhm.
I also realize that probably doesn't make it any easier to kind of get traction on the on this initiative. So sorry for that, but I think like if you could create an issue in this working group's GitHub repo, and I think that would be a good place to discuss like what falls within our scope and where we could make progress.
Perfect.
Cool. Amazing. So we've ran over a little bit, but that was great. So the next step is what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the personas information and we're shamelessly just steal them from Jason's presentation and start markdown documents. And then we will collate the use cases that are right now floating around in those three or four Google Docs. And we're gonna take it from there, or steal or open source. Thanks for the comment. Okay, and our next meeting, last one this year, is going to be on December 28th. So all going to be collating the agenda really soon. And thank you. That was another very good meeting. Thank you all. Take care.